Greetings. Just wanted to make a very short video on the subject of One West history. And for those who don't know, my videos on One West history attempt to put forth small but nonetheless interesting details or points from One West history that can, serve as small pieces to add to the larger puzzle that is everyone's understanding of One West history. So, this is more for the sake of documenting history than a polemic. So I just want to say that as a disclaimer, although this video will be covering some very controversial subjects at certain points, it's nonetheless is not intended as a polemic. This is just for the historical record, as it were. And so jumping right in, on your screen is an article from the New York Times, from the issue of the New York Times that came out on the 23rd of May 23rd in 1993. So this article is nearly 30 years old. It's just a few months shy of being 29 years old. And the reason why I wanted to get into it is because it mentions One West. It mentions, the Israeli School of Universal Practical Knowledge, and it mentions one particular person at One West who was one of the highest ranking members underneath the Seven Heads. He wasn't a member of the Seven Heads of the Israeli School of UPK, but underneath the Seven Heads, he was one of the highest ranking members. And that's, we'll see who that is in a second. And, it's interesting to look at this because seeing him mentioned 30 years ago sort of is a testament to how long he's been teaching what he's been teaching, how long he's been involved in this process. So the gist of the article is that it's covering public access television, mainly in New York, specifically Manhattan and Westchester, although it does briefly make allusions to public access television in Kansas City and in California. But the main focus is public access television in New York and groups that are putting forth teachings that are considered bigotry, right? And so it mentions Israelites associated with One West, and then it also mentions neo-Nazis, not conflating the two, but the two are nonetheless, there is a juxtaposition of the two. But whatever the case, and then there's also the legal questions about, how that works vis-a-vis free speech laws. So jumping right in, I want to go to the beginning of the article, which begins as follows. It says, quote, "On a recent Friday night, drowsy Westchester residents gliding through their cable television channels for something soothing and soporific were startled awake by what they saw on one public access program. A colorfully garbed man named Tahar, who calls himself a high priest of the Black Israelites, was brandishing a baseball bat." Now, for those who don't know, Tahar is the leader of a group that's currently known as Great Millstone. It's a particularly infamous group. It's also known as GMS, GMS being short for Great Millstone, and it's widely considered perhaps the most infamous or the most politically incorrect of all Israelite groups, and most other Israelites distance themselves from Tahar and from Great Millstone. But so that's interesting. He's still alive today. He's still teaching today. And so it's interesting to see him mentioned in an article from nearly 30 years ago. But returning to the article, it says a colorfully garbed man named Tahar, who calls himself a high priest of the Black Israelites, was brandishing a baseball bat. Quote, "We're going to be beating the hell out of you white people," end quote, he proclaimed. Then, lacing his threats with Bible passages, he warned, quote, "We're going to take your little children and dash them against the stones," end quote, and, quote, "We're going to RAPE and ravish your white women," end quote. And so I'll stop here. That is a particularly infamous teaching of Great Millstone, and many people believe it is exclusive to Great Millstone and exclusive to Tahar. However, I remember close to a decade ago, KOC from Rebel Alliance Media had raised the question of whether or not that teaching, or at least the roots of that teaching, went back to One West, and not in the sense that One West was officially teaching this, but rather in the sense that certain persons within the One West spectrum, within One West, were teaching it in the 90s, or at least, speaking these kind of things, even if it wasn't an official position of the organization. So at the very least, we see that Tahar was teaching this while he was with One West, and that's interesting. But anyway, getting back to the article, it says, according to organizations who track hate groups, public access cable channels, originally intended as a kind of electronic soapbox, have become a growing forum for preachers of racial and religious animosities, including those who encourage violence. Cable companies, including TCI Cable of Westchester, say that federal laws give them little choice but to broadcast these messages. And so again, this is where, the free speech issues get into, and the legal questions of allowing this sort of thing. It continues, Tahar, whose group prophesies a racial war in which blacks will avenge their enslavement, can be seen every other Friday at midnight. In Manhattan on Thursday night, cable viewers could have watched Herbert Poinsett, a swastika-sleeved neo-Nazi, preside over a talk show in which he urged the deportation of blacks to Africa and described the Holocaust as a fiction. Ku Klux Klan leaders have produced regularly scheduled shows in Kansas City, and the White Aryan Resistance puts on a popular program in California. And it says these shows are televised by cable companies operated by such corporate giants as Time Warner Incorporated, Telecommunications Incorporated. And in a 1991 report, the Anti-Defamation League identified 57 such programs in 24 of the 100 largest cable markets. And so we're at the end of the article on page 29, and then it jumps to page 34. So I'm going to jump now to page 34 and pick it up there. Moving right in, it talks about, whether or not they can be censored. And this is where we get another excerpt that mentions Tahar. It says, in pondering the legal issues in such a challenge, lawyers for the New York Civil Liberties Union doubt that even Tahar's threats of violence against women and children can be banned because they do not pose the kind of imminent threat of violence that lawyers say is the only grounds for prohibition under Supreme Court interpretations of the First Amendment. This is interesting because I think it shows that between 25 to 30 years ago, the popular understanding of free speech laws was somewhat different from what we see today. I think there's a much more of an acceptance among of censorship today. That's the impression I'm under, especially amongst the younger crowd. Those who are older can remember a time when free speech, the interpretations of free speech laws were much more broad and much stronger, to put it mildly. But anyway, the article continues quoting Norman Siegel, the executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, is stating, quote, these folks have a right to express their views regardless of how offensive, repugnant, bizarre, or wrong-minded they are. And I think I'll just go ahead and jump ahead to another portion which mentions specifically the One West. Actually, here, the Israeli school is mentioned explicitly. It says the hour-long show, titled It's Time to Wake Up, is a mixture of apocalyptic prophecy, snippets of history, and archaeology, and street talk buttressed by quotations from the Bible. It is produced by members of the Israeli School of Universal Practical Knowledge. And I want to stop here real quick just to say that some believe that One West used to be called the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, and there's even a claim out there that when they were later called the Israeli Church of Universal Practical Knowledge, they only chose the word Israeli to sort of throw off the scent of, I don't know, spies, government agents, government scrutiny or whatever. But the reality is that it was called the Israeli School of Universal Practical Knowledge, and that reflected a somewhat of a different attitude towards the word Israeli. Now One Westers and Israelites in general have come to adopt a hostility to the word Israeli. They're sort of ready to just concede that word to citizens of the modern state of Israel, to mainstream Jews, and they see it as an inauthentic word. I have a video on that, on how that's somewhat curious, because Israeli itself is a biblical word. But whatever the case, it's interesting to see this nearly 30-year-old article documenting that in 1993, the group was called the Israeli School of Universal Practical Knowledge. And in a future video, I'll show a bit more evidence of that. We've already shown how when Bibbins was alive, One West was known as the Israeli Tanakh School. But anyway, getting back to the article, it says it's produced by members of the Israeli School of Universal Practical Knowledge, whose office is at 1 West 125th Street in Manhattan, and whose members preach in Harlem and Times Square. Lane Young, the show's producer, said his group was not affiliated with other black Israelite groups that have gained prominence in recent years. And then it has a section titled The Lost Tribes, and it continues. His group claims that American blacks, West Indians, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and others are descendants of lost tribes of Israel and make up the true chosen people, and says Jews, and here it means mainstream Jews, says Jews are imposters. At one point in Tahar's April 3rd show, Mr. Young, one of two sidekicks flanking Tahar, used a whip to lash a Hanukkah poster published by the Lubavitch Hasidim that showed a smiling father and his son lighting a menorah. And as he lashed away, Mr. Young shouted, imposters, and the real Jews are black. The show also slurred homosexuals. Real quick about Lubavitch, for those who don't know, the Lubavitch Hasidim, the Lubavitcher group, is the largest Hasidic group, one of the largest Hasidic groups in New York City. They're based in Crown Heights. I think the only other Hasidic group which rivals them in terms of size is Satmar, based in Williamsburg, so both being neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So you have this sort of interesting, very New York encounter here, where Tahar, a member of One West, is interacting with a poster which was put out by Chabad Lubavitch, one of the largest Hasidic groups. An interaction between two very New York groups at the time. But moving on, it says in a telephone interview, Mr. Young said he was a 35-year-old resident of White Plains who works in a law enforcement branch that he declined to specify. He told of producing his shows with some painted plywood sets and a video camera at the Israeli school and at his house. Real quick note on the law enforcement part, there's been a shift in attitudes amongst some, including Tahar, vis-a-vis law enforcement. You know, I remember in years past, they would talk about if they had a member who was in law enforcement that was no different from, an Israelite in the ancient world being a conscript in, the Roman military. However, when Tahar began to have a more explicit falling out with specifically Nathaniel, the leader of IUIC, the fact that Nathaniel had been a member of the New York City police force was then used against him. There was a more explicit hostility to being a member of a police force then. But I don't know. I think this captures how it wasn't such an issue back then. You could have a member who was openly a member of the church or a member of the school who was openly a member of law enforcement back in the 90s. And anyway, getting back to the article, it says he maintained that he was not urging viewers to commit violence, though he predicted violence would happen. The one who everyone calls God is orchestrating it, he said. If some deranged person goes out and does that, then the Lord, the one who we call the Most High, put that idea into his head. And, I guess I'll show you that you can look at the rest of the article, and I'll try to, perhaps you could pause your screen and take a screenshot. I'll also link to a place where you can at least get the full text. Whether or not you'll be able to get the scan of this article will depend on your level of access with the New York Times website. But nonetheless, I'll stop here. I hope you found this article interesting. The main reason I wanted to show it is particularly because it shows Tahar, already teaching in 1993. It's my understanding he says that he's started in the 80s, if I recall correctly. I think I heard him back in 2008 talk about being in it for nearly 25 years back then. So at this point, he may be closing in on being part of the One West Spectrum for 40 years. Nonetheless, this is an interesting little historical nugget because it shows Tahar, captured in an article, mentioned in an article from nearly 30 years ago, teaching things very similar to what he teaches today. And I think that's a testament to how long he's been involved in these sort of activities. On that note, I hope you found it interesting. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.